So, welcome everybody to this session called Copilot Ready, one small step for the IT administrator or one giant leap for the organization. We who will take you through the next 40 minutes are me, Magnus Goksöyr, and Daniel Sønstevold. And we hope that we will be able to provide you with some knowledge that you can take with you on the way. Now, most of you have surely already heard a lot of Copilot and how much we will be able to increase our productivity using it. But what needs to be done before we can really benefit from it in a good and safe way? These days, there are many advisors who have many good answers and concepts on how to become Copilot ready or optimized for Copilot. And these concepts are often very comprehensive and many different truths are delivered. So with this presentation, Daniel and I want to try to bring this down to a more easily understandable level. So our focus will be, as Peter said, on security and compliance within the Microsoft 365. And we hope to be able to give you some concrete and tangible advice that you can benefit from to be able to introduce Copilot for Microsoft 365 in your company in a safe way. The structure of the session will be as follows. The first half, I will talk about the old but constantly current topics of basic security settings and data quality. And the second half, Daniel will show you how you can analyze and identify your sensitive data and then provide it with an extra layer of security. And we also want to clarify that we will use both the term data and the term information, but for the sake of the simplicity, you can assume that we mean the same thing. So to start with, we would like to show you what Copilot in PowerPoint has to say about this presentation. It says that Copilot for Microsoft 365 is a tool that helps analyze and consolidate data, and that data quality and security are important to give the best results, and that data should be correctly stored, secured, and labeled, and that automated retention policies and DLP rules can help with sensitive data. And this sums up the content pretty well, even if a few things are missing, but at least this time Copilot hasn't invented anything of its own like it usually does otherwise. Now let's get started with the basic security measures in Microsoft 365. For those of you who haven't met me before, my name is Magnus Goksöyr. I'm Swedish, I'm from Sweden, and I work in Norway for an IT company called Evidi. I am MVP within Microsoft 365 apps and services, and I work with Microsoft 365 in general, but I'm specialized in Microsoft Teams. So mostly I work with collaboration and modern workplace and governance, and thus is it also natural that I work with the security and compliance. So for the coming 20 minutes, or perhaps 17 now, before Daniel takes over the show, I'm going to talk to you about basic security measures in Microsoft 365 from a Copilot perspective. Well, every one of you has probably read and heard more than enough about what Copilot for Microsoft 365 is, and some of you may have already started using it. But for those of you who don't know what it is, we can simply sum it up as a turbocharged version of yourself when working with the organization's data or information. It quickly searches through existing data. It analyzes and consolidates existing data. It gives you advice based on existing data. And it helps you create drafts and come up with ideas based on existing data. Now, before we go any further, I'd like to do a little quick check here. Can all of you who are already using Copilot for Microsoft 365 please press the react button and show this by giving a thumbs up? Hey. Lots of thumbs there. Impressive, and perhaps also alarming number of thumbs appearing on the screen here. So you're either just getting started or you have already started to use Copilot for Microsoft 365. And if so, there are some questions you should have asked yourself or should ask yourself. And here are some of them. Can you be absolutely sure that your access to all the data you need is the data reliable, current, and relevant? Are you sure that you do not have access to data that you perhaps should not have access to? Are you sure that your colleagues do not have access to some of your data that are not of a nature that should be shared with them, either now or later? And can you be sure that Copilot from Microsoft 365 cannot cause any problems by reading and use this sensitive and confidential data that you have access to? So with this in mind, what is data quality and security so important? Well, the quality of your data is important because Copilot from Microsoft 365 doesn't learn, but it assists you based on your existing data. And thus, if the quality of your underlying data is poor, then the advice and summaries from Copilot will also be poor. Bad content equals bad output. That's a nice paraphrase of an old saying, which I cannot mention here. Security is important because if the security of your underlying data is poor, then the advice and summaries from Copilot will also risk containing data that may come from sensitive documents whose content should not be shared further. And as you can see on this picture, when your sensitive or confidential data is flagged correctly, this should be displayed when you're using Copilot. And if not, you risk to share information that you should not have shared. This cannot be mentioned enough times. Copilot from Microsoft 365 has access only to the data that you have access to. So in other words, you don't have to worry if the access rights were correct from the start or if you have corrected the access rights in the recent past. And this is actually old news because basic security and protection of the data in your tenant is nothing new or something that is suddenly needed just because of Copilot from Microsoft 365. So if you until now have neglected to secure your data sufficiently, you have had the same challenge for several years since Microsoft Search also searches all the data that you have access to. The reason for why it is now even more important to have secured your data is that Copilot is much faster and more efficient than you are in searching for and making data visible to you. And this leads to that sensitive or confidential data that you have been more or less blissfully unaware of can now suddenly become very clear. And considering this, let's do another quick check. Who of you can in good conscience say that you are confident that your organization's information is 100% or at least good enough secured? React with a heart if you can. Okay. Not so many hearts that appeared here, and that is good because then you will get some tips here that will help you on the way further on. First of all, I want to give you advice not to overwork it all because security versus usability must always be balanced so that you do not secure your tenant too much that it cannot be used. A tenant that is 100% secure becomes more or less unusable, and therefore you must use the right security mechanism that cause as little negative impact as possible on your colleagues' daily tasks. Because your colleagues' daily work must not become too complicated, because then the result will only be that they find other ways and means of working with and sharing information. So let me make an analogy to illustrate why the basic work with security is so important. When you build a new house, then the craftsmen and the craftsmanship are very important. If you cheat with the craft, you will sooner or later get moisture damages and mold and maybe even cracks in the foundation of the house. If you do not have sealed windows and lockable doors, you can or will get unexpected visitors. And large panoramic windows can be nice, but do you want anyone to be able to look into your house? And the same important craftsmanship applies when you shall secure your data. If you cheat or neglect it, sooner or later you will experience bad things with your important data. It might get deleted involuntarily or intentionally. It might get shared with people who should not have access to the data. It might be unintentionally changed or deliberately manipulated. And finally, it might get stolen or in worst case hijacked. It is important that the basic philosophy is always zero trust at all levels, and this is fundamental if you really want to be safe. If a platform is not secured, the data that is entered, stored, or processed on the platform will not be secure either. So therefore, you must ensure that you secure your endpoints, your identities, your network, infrastructure, and applications. And of course, you must not forget to secure your data, which is what we'll talk more about now. By clearly defining where we should store confidential or sensitive data, we know which areas that need extra protection. Because data floating around on different OneDrives or in various teams or document libraries on SharePoint sites is very difficult to identify if they have not been classified as sensitive information. So confidential or sensitive data should be stored in dedicated containers that are known and adequately protected. Now, if you don't know where different types of data resides, you won't be able to secure them. Therefore, you should take control of where your data is and should be stored and secured. Therefore, you need to clean up and get rid of all irrelevant data that can disturb, misinform, and confuse Copilot for Microsoft 365, and thus also you, yourself, and your colleagues. So you need to find out where your sensitive data is stored today, and then you have to get your colleagues to understand where and why your sensitive and confidential data will be stored and protected in the future. To store data in the right place is a message I have been preaching since I started working with Office 365 or Microsoft 365. It is incredibly important that everyone works with the same applications in the same way and that they store all data where it belongs. It has always been important for the reason that there should be no ambiguity about where to store and thus find the data afterwards. And this is to make it easy for all users, but also so that we as administrators know how and where we need to secure information in different ways, and not least with regards to retention, so that we know which data is important to keep and which data can eventually be deleted. So if you haven't gotten this message out in your organization, you need to address this now and create a general understanding of how and where you should work and how and where you should store information with different levels of security. If the information no longer has any value, there is no reason to save it and thus create confusion for you and your colleagues when Copilot for Microsoft 365 accesses it and bases its tips and advice on it. There are several ways to increase and improve your data quality. And one way is to identify and delete old data that no longer has any value. Now, if we presume that the most common places in your organization where data is stored are SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams, this is where you need to start cleaning up. And here you can do that in an old traditional manual and also boring way by using the Teams Admin Center and SharePoint Admin Center. Many of us are comfortable and used to pulling reports on the least used areas and then finding out if the content can be deleted. But when it comes to large number of sites and teams, it can be an advantage to use tools for this work. So with SharePoint Advanced Management, SAM, and SharePoint Premium, this work becomes much easier. And additionally, there are also very competent third-party products that can help you with this work. When it comes to furthering security information, for example, with Purview, there's a lot that can be automated, but it is not certain that it is right to automate everything completely from the start. So make sure you've done the basic work right first. After that, when you know where the information is stored, what type of classification or labels the respective information type should have, and you have planned this all carefully, then you can start looking at how you can automate it all. So let's now take a look at the most basic things you can do when it comes to securing the applications we use the most. When it comes to basic protection of SharePoint, you should make sure that you don't overshare the information you get stored on SharePoint. And you also need to ensure that the company's global sharing settings for SharePoint and OneDrive are not more generous than necessary. So the default setting should be that you share with individuals and selected people. Using N1 links is not optimal, nor is sharing with everyone in the organization as default. And you need to create dedicated areas if you need to store sensitive or secret information, and then add additional security to those areas. And it's also important to set up the basic accesses correctly, that you use relevant and preferably dynamic security groups to control access to your SharePoint sites. And you should never use the group everyone except external users. I know many of you does that. I have done it many years also, but sometimes, and actually quite often, it contains people who are not actual employees of your organization and thus should not have access to those documents. You also need to identify and correct whether inherited access rights on document libraries, folders, and files on your SharePoint sites have been broken, and someone may have been too generous with access rights to those. When it comes to OneDrive for Business, it's important that you make sure also here that you don't overshare the information you have stored on OneDrive for Business. So like I said in the previous slide, ensure that the company's sharing settings for SharePoint and OneDrive are not more generous than necessary. And you should also think of if you should allow people to synchronize the personal OneDrives, not to be confused with OneDrive for Business, to your work computer. Could that be a risk that you get information on the organization's devices that doesn't really belong there and perhaps is not secured as it should be? When it comes to basic protection of Microsoft Teams, you want to make sure that the teams that need to be private really are private. If the privacy level of a team is set to public, its documents are available to everyone in the organization, regardless of whether they are members of the team or not. You should use sensitivity labels for Microsoft Teams to set the privacy level, public or private, and also control guest access. Through this, you can control the classification of the team's associated SharePoint site. You should automate the provisioning of new teams with the provisioning app so that based on the selected team type, the team is provided with the correct settings and sensitivity label already at the provisioning. And you should not tamper with the access rights on the team's associated SharePoint site to give someone more rights. That will cause you to lose your control. Last but not least, some tips on the solutions and tools you can use on your way to get ready for Copilot for Microsoft 365. First of all, use sensitivity labels. By putting labels on different types of information, you can apply associated policies for how each label should be handled. Second, make sure you manage the access rights to your SharePoint sites and your teams in a uniform and structured way. And by using dynamic entry ID groups and by having a good onboarding and offboarding process, you minimize the risks of access problems. You should also use access reviews to regularly and automatically keep track of which people no longer needs access. And 4, use DLP policies to control which actions should be allowed to be performed on different types of sensitive information. And last but not least, you should automate parts of your house cleaning by establishing retention policies that helps you delete information that can be deleted, and at the same time helps you keep relevant information that must be kept. That's all I had to convey today, and I hope you, on this short time, have gained some useful tips through my presentation. If you have any questions for me, feel free to ask them in the chat, and I will answer them as soon as I can. So now, over to Daniel, and he will take over and show you the more interesting and technical parts of this subject. Thanks a lot, and over to Daniel.
Thank you, Magnus. Yes, Well, hello everyone. My name is Daniel Sønstevold, and for those not wanting to bother with the pronunciation of the O/ or the Ö, the surname would be loosely translated as South Hill. I'm a senior consultant in Evidi, the same company as Magnus. I'm based in Oslo, Norway. And I have, as many amongst us, lately been focusing a great deal on Copilot for Microsoft 365. As you can see from the headline, it says Copilot Optimized. And when this session was submitted to Teams Nation, Microsoft still called it all Copilot Ready, but they have since changed it to separate it into Copilot Ready and Copilot Optimized. And for the next 20 minutes, we're going to focus on compliance solved through Microsoft Purview. And we'll look at some core functionality in Purview and move on to some examples of how this can impact the end user. And fair warning, I've recently learned the morph function in PowerPoint, and yes, I have gone overboard. So I'm going to start off with a slide from Microsoft. And as stated, Microsoft has established the terms Copilot Ready and Copilot Optimized. Ready being the absolute minimum requirements that you need to activate the technology and be able to somehow benefit from its use. Optimized is what's needed to safely and properly adopt Copilot for realizing its full potential. And our recommendation is to be ready for a pilot project and get optimized for a full-scale rollout. Being Copilot Ready, licenses and access management are the foundation blocks, as you can see on the bottom row. And the next level are the applications through which Copilot is available. So this is the technical requirement to actually activate Copilot. But we're looking at Copilot Optimized. And as Magnus has already spoken about SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams to some extent, what's left that's relevant for the Microsoft Purview compliance portal is automatic file classification, data loss prevention rules, and automatic retention. These topics have some corresponding features and functionality in Microsoft Purview. So let's start looking at what this means in a Purview context. Now, automatic file classification can be broken into two modules from Purview, classifiers and information protection. And classifiers are used to automate and detect your sensitive information. These are some images from the Purview portal for the relevant topic, and trainable classifiers, as the first tab to the left, will scan for recognizable data sets such as budgets, financial audit reports, or discriminating language. In the next tab, which is also visible, you have sensitive information types, and these scan for more specific kinds of numbers or text as standalone occurrences or in relation to something natural appearing within the same content. So diseases, ID numbers, or credit card numbers being some examples that might also be triggered by having a number sequence written close to in proximity to the word credit card. And then there's EDM classifiers, or exact data matches, which use exact values from your data, like a project name or a code, instead of the generic patterns from the alternatives. Now, trainable classifiers and sensitive information types, they both have some default builds you can use, and they can also be built custom to fit your needs. While exact data match, for obvious reasons, are exclusively custom. So having all these classifiers, we want to apply them to actually classify our files, storage, and collaboration spaces. And this is done through building sensitivity labels in the module for information protection. Labels can be applied to emails, meetings, files, Teams, and SharePoint sites, and the labels help with both awareness for the end user and also some technical restrictions through watermarks or encryption, forwarding restrictions, external sharing settings, and conditional access. So when a label structure is built, the biggest part of the job is actually finding a structure that gives a sufficient level of security measures, but also distributed across an amount of labels that is easy to handle for the end user. Even though there are several things that overlap and you need a steady hand, setting up the structure is generally more demanding than setting up the technical solution and creating the labels themselves. Now, applying the labels, you must also consider a level of interaction with the end user, as Magnus mentioned previously, that ensures that the measures are actually adopted rather than creating some creative workarounds and potentially actually decreasing the security rather than improving it. That brings us to data loss prevention rules, which are translated quite directly to Purview's data loss prevention module. Now, DLP policies act on the classifiers that we spoke about initially, along with the rules that you choose to apply with them. So you can use this to stop someone from sending an email or a Teams message with a certain content, or you can allow that kind of behavior, but get notified as an admin regarding the behavior itself. Setting up the data loss prevention policies, you can use the dashboard to set them up for specific classifiers. You can group them for all Teams and email, or specific user groups or groups that shouldn't be able to perform certain actions. And a bit nitty-gritty, but a policy can audit or block users' ability to, for instance, copy sensitive information to browsers or certain domains. You can restrict copying or downloading to USB devices, printing the information, and so on. And lastly, we have automatic retention, or in Purview terms, data lifecycle management, which is used to set retention or automatic deletion for emails, files, and a lot more. Now, setting retention policies and label exceptions for those policies so that not everything is impacted, it helps us keep the valuable information and throw away the garbage, as Magnus also mentioned. It's great for a sustainability perspective, and it allows us to maintain a slow and healthy increase in our data. It saves on storage and storage cost, and it has obvious benefits for getting the most out of Copilot, because Copilot is just a tool. And when you prompt Copilot against your own data, the tool won't be able to evaluate the relevance of the references based on the content itself. So, when we apply sensitivity labels, data loss prevention policies, and retention policies, what do we achieve? Well, at least we have an intention and an aim to achieve something. And the technical setup in Purview allows us to make important impact regardless of Copilot, but even more so when we're adding that capability to our system and provide it to our users. So firstly, let's have a look at the consequences of labeling teams. In Teams settings, we still have the same padlock icon symbolizing the privacy settings for a private team rather than a public team and so on. But there's also a new little tag next to it. So editing the Teams details will now give us the opportunity to choose a sensitivity label. And for this instance, I've made a label with a poor description as it prevents external users and guests from being added to the team altogether. And for quick attendees, the possibility to prevent external access is of course available other places, but the label gives me the opportunity to set this label and impact specific teams and not do it tenant-wide. This particular label also prohibits the content, access to content from unmanaged devices, and the users are able to add members from their own organization, as shown in this quick snippet, but it's not possible to add any external addresses. Additionally, we're also able to label a team or SharePoint library to impact the content that's stored there. So we can label teams, but we can also label files. Now, there goes my morph. So when we move to the library settings, it's possible to apply a default label for the library. And this label must be set up for files in the background in Purview, and will then be forced as a default label for all applicable content created, uploaded, or existing content edited in that specific SharePoint library. Which moves us to stopping oversharing. So you will have to excuse my Norwegian settings for this Copilot relevant snippet, but using it live was the only and simple option. Now, having Copilot draft a Word document, it's old news by now, but there's no automatic labeling for this file. However, when I choose the label restricted internal, it contains some watermarks bringing awareness, but the biggest value will appear in the PowerPoint presentation. For the sake of the example, I've prompted the Copilot in PowerPoint to create the presentation based on a file that I just created and I know is classified with a certain label to trigger an event. But this will also work in exactly the same way if the prompt doesn't reference a specific file. And the new content, regardless of application crossover between Words, PowerPoint, and Excel, will always inherit the highest prioritized label from whatever source of inspiration Copilot is using. So as you can see, I get notified as a user that my content has been given a sensitivity label. And this is a really important step for preventing users unintentional data leakage after having used Copilots for a productive process where they don't necessarily know the sourced material for Copilot. Another aspect of preventing oversharing is the effect of data loss prevention policies. As this is a Teams nation, I'm including an example of how a DLP policy can help prevent oversharing internally based on sensitive information types. So this one is set up quite strict with no possible way to justify sending the message after being noticed, but it serves as an extreme example of how we can limit unwanted behavior. And then that behavior should be routed in the correct way and medium. So for a bit of a sneaky example regarding retention, keeping our sources relevant. How many, by show of any emoji, have set up retention in their mailbox, or at least knew about the possibility? Unfortunately, I can't see that reaction, but
quite many there then.
That's good. Because these are the default policies that a user can apply themselves, but they can also be adjusted to delete instead of archive, and you can, if you use archive, manually delete that archive after a given period. Or you can get started with setting up Purview to handle this with policies for the entire organization, specific groups, or users. Now, data lifecycle management is amongst the most time-consuming things to get right with Purview, but it will give direct value for Copilot regarding relevance. It will impact the cost of storage, and it also has the benefit of positive environmental impact. So thank you all for listening in. I hope this was of value to you. I hope you were inspired to start the process of getting optimized for Copilot for Microsoft 365 with Purview. Purview, for those with the correct access, is found on compliance.microsoft.com. And yeah, thank you so much.